September 17th, 1940. A man is sweating. Not from the heat. There is no heat. The room is cold. The cold of English stone in autumn. The kind that settles into the joints and refuses to leave. He is sweating because of what sits across the table. The man across the table is completely still. He has not moved in 4 minutes. He is not reading the folder in front of him. He is not writing notes. He is simply watching. One natural eye. The warmth of a winter sky. One glass eye. No warmth at all. The man in the hot seat, let us call him the agent, because his real name is still classified, is one of Adolf Hitler's finest trained spies. He parachuted into a muddy Kent field 3 nights ago. Forged identity papers. A wireless transmitter wrapped in oilskin. Instructions from the Abwehr, German military intelligence, that he had memorized, and then burned. He has been trained to resist interrogation. He has been told what the British do to men like him. He has prepared himself to endure. He has no idea that the man across the table already knows his name, his cover identity, his handler's code name in Hamburg, the street in Bavaria where his mother still lives. He has no idea that the resistance he has prepared is already over. But here is what you need to understand about the man with the glass eye. The detail that historians still argue about today. He has not used a single act of violence. He never does. And that choice, that single, strange, controversial choice, will eventually help change the outcome of the Second World War. But it will also, years later, nearly destroy him. And his name was Lieutenant Colonel Robin William George Stevens. His prisoners called him Tin Eye. His own government, in classified files that remain sealed for decades, called him the most effective interrogator in the history of British intelligence. Pause. And his most infamous rule, the rule that set him apart from every interrogation commander on every side of the most devastating war in human history, was this: never strike a man. He will lie. This is the story of the man who ran Britain's most feared intelligence facility during the darkest years of the Second World War. A man who absolutely refused to use physical violence against prisoners. A man who personally dismissed his own officers for raising a hand against an enemy. A man who broke the most dangerous Nazi agents in Europe, using nothing but psychology. And a man whose story ends with one of the most devastating ironies you will hear in this series. Stay with this one, because the ending will reframe everything that came before it. Before we go further, if you're still here, you already know this story is different. Subscribe now so you don't miss where it ends. Trust me, you need to see where it ends. Hit like if Tin Eye has your attention. Now, back to the room. To understand what Robin Stevens was, you first have to understand what Britain was facing in 1940. The numbers are staggering. In less than 12 months, Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven into the sea at Dunkirk, rescued, barely, by a fleet of civilian boats. Yes, the Luftwaffe was reducing English cities to smoking rubble on a nightly schedule, and German military intelligence, the Abwehr, was deploying trained agents into Britain at a rate that MI5 could barely track, let alone counter. These were not amateurs dropping into English fields. They were products of sophisticated training programs. They spoke the language. They carried credible documentation. Some had lived in England before the war. They knew English culture from the inside. Their mission? Report on RAF airfields, coastal defenses, troop movements, anything that might support a German invasion of the British mainland. A mainland Hitler's generals were actively planning to take. Britain needed intelligence. Not just any intelligence, accurate intelligence. Because in 1940, a single false piece of information acted upon could mean the difference between a defended coastline and an open one. Between a war that lasted until 1943 and a war that was over by 1941. Britain could not afford lies. This is why Camp 020 was created. Officially, it was called Latchmere House, a Victorian mansion requisitioned by Emperor V at the outbreak of war. Stripped of its furniture, converted into an interrogation facility. Its official designation, Camp 020. Its existence, classified. Its location, known to a very small number of people inside the British government. Its purpose was specific. Receive captured German intelligence agents and extract every piece of operational information they possessed. The question was, what does whatever means necessary actually mean? Into that question walked Robin Stevens, and his answer was not what anyone expected. Robin Stevens was not an obvious choice for a role that required human warmth. He did not possess any. Born in 1900, educated at Exeter College, Oxford, years in colonial service across India and Africa. He spoke 7 languages: German, French, Italian, Urdu, Amharic, Arabic, Persian. Not the polite language learning of a man who liked holidays abroad. The deep linguistic absorption of someone obsessively studying how different peoples think, how they construct meaning, where the gaps are between what a man says and what he actually means. Former colleagues described him with a striking consistency: cold, precise, relentless, intimidating in a way that had nothing to do with physical size, a man who gave the impression of calculating everything, including the exact social distance to maintain from every person in every room. The glass eye was an old injury. The monocle fitted over it gave him a gaze that did not work the way human eyes are supposed to work. It did not soften in laughter. It did not harden in anger. It simply watched. Always. With the same flat, unblinking attention that made prisoners feel they were being examined by something that had decided to impersonate a man, but hadn't quite mastered all the details. His staff, when interviewed after the war, reached for the same word: a machine. Not in any dehumanizing sense, in the sense of absolute precision, of systems that did not fail, of a man who had decided, at some point before anyone could remember, exactly what he was and was not going to do, and then executed that decision without deviation for the rest of his professional life. Tin Eye commanded Camp 020 from 1940 through the end of the war. During that time, the facility processed over 480 captured German intelligence agents. Not one of them escaped. Not one of them later recanted. And not one of them was struck. The first week Stevens took command, he called his entire interrogation staff together. Look at the men in that room for a moment. These are not desk officers. They are trained intelligence operatives. Many of them veterans. They have watched the Blitz from London rooftops. They have read the casualty reports from the Atlantic convoys. Ships sunk by German U-boats guided, at least in part, by intelligence passed from enemy agents who slipped through English fields in the dark. And the men sitting in the cells below their feet are not abstractions. They are part of a machine that is actively killing British sailors, British airmen, and British civilians. Every week. These officers expected to be told how to break prisoners. They expected a briefing on permitted methods. On limits, perhaps, but limits with room to move. They expected a conversation. What Stevens gave them was not a conversation. It was an order. There will be no striking of prisoners, no physical violence of any kind, no threats of physical harm. Anyone who violates this order will be removed from this facility immediately and will face consequences under military law. Silence. Not the polite silence of men nodding along. The dense, pressurized silence of men who have just heard something that does not make sense. Someone asked why. Stevens looked at the person who asked. There is no record of what that look contained. Given what we know of the man, it probably contained nothing at all. Just the flat attention of the glass eye, and the cold calculation of the natural one. Then he answered, because a man who has been struck will tell you whatever stops the pain. And that is useless to me. Notice something important here. Stevens did not say striking a prisoner was wrong. He did not invoke the Geneva Convention, British honor, the law of civilized nations. He did not make a moral argument. He made a professional one. A broken prisoner does not give you facts. A broken prisoner gives you the words he believes will make the pain stop. Those words might be true. They might be partially true. They might be entirely fabricated. And the critical problem, the problem that haunts every interrogation room that has ever existed, is that you cannot reliably tell the difference. Stevens was not running a facility for righteous anger. He was running a precision instrument for the extraction of accurate intelligence in a war that Britain was losing. And he had decided, with the absolute certainty of a man who has done the calculation and is not interested in debating the result, that brutality was the least efficient tool in the box. But here's the question that won't leave you alone once you've heard it. Was this a moral conviction or a professional strategy? Was Tin Eye protecting enemy prisoners because he believed they deserved protection? Or was he simply the coldest man in the room? Hold that question. Because in the final act of this story, it becomes the only question that matters. So if not violence, then what? The methods Stevens deployed at Camp 020 were, in their own way, more unsettling than physical force. Not because they caused visible damage, precisely because they didn't. The process began before the prisoner ever entered the interrogation room. Stevens prepared for each subject with a thoroughness that bordered on the obsessive. Every available scrap of intelligence was gathered and studied. Their obver training records, if obtainable. The known methods of their particular section. The regional and social background that shaped their assumptions and anxieties. The childhood. The relationships. The particular fears that men from this place, this unit, this background, tended to carry. Stevens wanted to know, before the prisoner sat down, exactly which thread to pull. Step 1. The silence of uncertainty. A prisoner arriving at Camp 020 was placed in a cell and left alone. Not in squalor, not in danger, but in a particular kind of silence. No information about what the British knew or didn't know. No indication of what had happened to other agents. No way to calibrate how much resistance was necessary, or how long it needed to last. The uncertainty was the instrument. A man who can see the shape of his situation can decide how to manage it. A man who cannot see anything at all has nothing to push against. His resistance becomes a fist swinging in the dark, exhausting, purposeless, and ultimately self-defeating. Step 2. The disruption. Sleep was disrupted. Not to the point of physical harm, that would have violated Stevens's own orders, but enough to make the walls feel uncertain, enough to make a man's thoughts unreliable guides. The human brain, deprived of adequate rest, loses its ability to maintain consistent deception. Stories start to shift. Internal timelines develop gaps. Details contradict each other in ways the prisoner cannot track or repair. The deception begins to fall apart from the inside. Step 3. Tin eye walks. In one of Stevens' former colleagues described watching him conduct interrogations and feeling not pity for the prisoner exactly, but something like awe. Tin Eye would enter the room and sit down, open his folder, look at whatever was inside it for a long, deliberate, absolutely silent moment. The prisoner would watch him, try to read the room, find nothing to read. No anger, no eagerness, no emotion of any readable kind. And then Stevens would look up, and he would say something the prisoner had not told him, something the prisoner was certain the British could not know. In one declassified account from the 1990s, a captured agent described the moment in a post-war statement. Stevens had looked up from his folder and said aloud the operational code name that only 2 people in the Abwehr's Hamburg section were supposed to know: the agent himself and his controller. The agent stared at Stevens. Stevens waited. In that silence, the agent understood. Something had already gone catastrophically wrong on the German side. Either his controller had been turned, or British intelligence had penetrated Abwehr Hamburg at a level that made any further concealment completely pointless. He started talking. Not because of pain, not because of fear of pain, but because he was a rational man who had just been shown, conclusively, that the calculation was already done. And the answer was not in his favor. This was Stevens's genius. Not the monocle, not the theatrical stillness, not the cold manner, though all of those were deliberate instruments. The genius was in making a prisoner feel not that resistance was too painful to continue, but that it was already too late to matter. What Camp 020 produced under Stevens' command was more than a series of individual confessions. It produced the foundation of one of the most audacious intelligence operations in the history of warfare. In what became known as the double cross system, officially the XX system, captured German agents were not simply imprisoned and neutralized. They were turned, persuaded, not tortured, but persuaded, to continue transmitting to their Abwehr handlers in Germany. But the transmissions were now controlled by British intelligence. Under FM 5 supervision, these agents sent back to Berlin exactly what the British wanted Germany to believe: false troop positions, invented weapon deployments, fabricated reports on the accuracy of German bombing campaigns, reports that guided Luftwaffe targeting away from critical infrastructure and toward areas already destroyed. Berlin received this information, and in most cases believed it, because it came from their own agents. Agents whose reliability had been established over months of accurate reporting. Agents who had not, as far as the Abwehr could tell, ever been compromised. And then, as the war moved toward its most critical moment, the double-cross system was turned toward something that would save tens of thousands of lives, something called Operation Fortitude. The problem facing Allied planners in 1944 was not whether they could land on the beaches of Normandy. They could. The problem was what would happen in the hours and days after they landed, before the beachhead was secured, when German armored reserves could potentially drive the entire Allied force back into the sea. The solution was a lie of historic scale: convince Hitler's high command that the Normandy landings were a feint, that the real Allied invasion, the one that mattered, the one led by the imaginary 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General Patton, would come at Pas de Calais, 300 kilometers to the northeast. Keep the German panzers waiting there. It worked. For critical weeks after the June 6th landings, German armored divisions capable of potentially crushing the Normandy beachhead sat at Pas de Calais, waiting for an invasion that was never coming. The intelligence networks that fed this disinformation to Hitler's planners were built, agent by agent, interrogation by interrogation, inside the quiet rooms of Camp 020, by a man who never raised his fist. When historians calculate the lives saved by Operation Fortitude, and the estimates reach into the tens of thousands, the chain of causation runs backward. Through the double-cross system, through the walls of Latchmere House, to a rule announced in a briefing room in Surrey in 1940. A man who has been struck will tell you whatever stops the pain. And that is useless to me. Bassos. But here's where the story takes a turn that no one, not even Tin Eye's greatest admirers, can fully explain away. Standards held in principle are not the same as standards maintained in practice. And the gap between the two is where the full and complicated measure of Robin Stevens is found. The war was real. The men in those cells had done real damage, and the interrogators of Camp 020 were human beings. They carried to their work everything that human beings carry: grief, fury, the specific and corrosive knowledge of what these particular men had done, and what their information had cost. Some of Stevens' staff had personal reasons to want those prisoners to hurt. Friends killed in the Blitz, brothers lost in the Atlantic, and the particular rage that comes from being asked to maintain professional detachment from someone who contributed, however indirectly, to the death of someone you loved. At some point, the exact circumstances remain partially classified, the timeline disputed. One of Stevens' senior interrogators used physical force against a prisoner. The details vary depending on the source. What does not vary is the aftermath. When Stevens found out, there was no review, no discussion, no consideration of wartime pressure or extenuating circumstances, or the fact that the officer in question was otherwise competent, otherwise valuable, otherwise a man doing impossible work under terrible conditions. The officer was removed from Camp 020 immediately. Other staff watched this happen and understood with absolute clarity what they were watching. And this was not Tin Eye performing virtue for an audience. This was a commander enforcing a standard with exactly the same undeviating precision he enforced everything else. Because he understood, at a level that cut through emotion entirely, what happened the moment an interrogation facility compromised its own method. The moment violence entered those rooms, every result became untrustworthy. The entire apparatus, the turned agents, the false transmissions, the disinformation networks feeding Allied planning, rested on the reliability of what was extracted at Camp 020. Contaminate the extraction method, and you contaminate everything downstream. The fired officer was not a victim of Stevens' cold perfectionism. He was a risk to the entire operation. And operations that Stevens ran did not carry avoidable risks. The reluctant respect. The prisoners themselves, years after the war, in interviews and post-war statements, describe their time at Camp 020 with something that is genuinely difficult to categorize. Not gratitude, not warmth, nothing so simple. A strange, reluctant respect. They had been broken, Yes. Their secrets had been extracted, their missions destroyed, their sense of the mission's viability dismantled with surgical precision. But they had been broken cleanly, without the lasting physical damage that leaves a man not just defeated, but shattered in ways that have nothing to do with information. One former agent put it in a post-war statement that historians have returned to repeatedly. I feared Stevens completely, but I was never humiliated by him. There is a difference. He took what he needed, but he left me myself. Yes. He left me myself. 5 words. Think about what they mean. Coming from a man who entered that room as a trained enemy operative and left having handed over everything he knew. Now hold that sentence, because in about 4 minutes, you're going to hear something that will put it in an entirely different light. The war ended in May 1945. Camp 020 closed. Its files were sealed. Its methods were classified. Robin Stevens, Tin Eye, the most effective interrogator Britain had produced, moved on to his next assignment, Germany. In the chaos of post-war occupied Germany, Stevens was tasked with running a detention facility for suspected Nazi war criminals and intelligence operatives. Men who had run the machinery of the Reich. Men who knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. Some of the most dangerous individuals in Europe. The camp was in a spa town in Lower Saxony called Bad Nendorf, and in 1947, an investigation was opened. What investigators found at Bad Nendorf was documented in British military records, classified for decades, and declassified in stages beginning in the 1990s. The findings were unambiguous. Prisoners had been subjected to prolonged cold, to forced labor in inadequate winter clothing, to systematic food deprivation that left men significantly malnourished. Multiple prisoners died in custody, or shortly after transfer. The conditions documented by investigators bore no resemblance, none, to the controlled, sophisticated, precisely managed environment that Stevens had enforced at Camp 020, with such absolute and punishing authority. A court-martial was convened. Stevens and several other officers faced charges. In the end, Stevens was acquitted on most counts. The proceedings were complicated. The evidence was contested. The context, post-war occupied Germany, strained resources, a population of genuine war criminals, was considered by the court. He emerged without conviction on the most serious charges, but not without a shadow. The shadow has never fully lifted, and it has generated, in the decades since, a question that historians return to with a regularity that suggests it has not been satisfactorily answered. Was Robin Stevens's principle, never strike a man, a genuine moral conviction? Or was it a professional tool, applied with full force when it served the mission, and set aside when the mission changed? Was he a man ahead of his time in understanding the relationship between humanity and effectiveness? Or was he a man of such crystalline pragmatism that he enforced humane standards precisely as long as they produced results, and found them less compelling in a context where the calculus was different? The honest answer is that the record does not resolve this. The man did not write the memoir that would have answered it. The files that might clarify the command decisions at Bad Nendorf remain partially classified. Stevens himself was not, by any account, a man who explained himself. What the record gives us is this: 2 facilities, 2 periods, 2 radically different outcomes. One man's name on both. History rarely gives us the clean moral portraits we prefer, and Tin Eye gives us nothing clean at all. Set aside for now the shadow of Bad Nendorf. not to excuse it, not to dismiss it, and it deserves every line of scrutiny it has received and will continue to receive. But to look clearly at what Robin Stevens built at Camp 020 and what it accomplished, the numbers speak in a register that is hard to absorb. Of the more than 480 German intelligence agents processed through Camp 020 during the war, not one successfully escaped. Not one agent broken by Stevens' methods later recanted their cooperation under German custody. Not one was identified as having fed the British false information to protect real intelligence networks. The double-cross system, built on the foundation of those interrogations, achieved what British intelligence historians describe in terms usually reserved for the miraculous: near total penetration of German intelligence networks operating in Britain. By the end of the war, virtually every German agent believed to be active in the United Kingdom was either in British custody or transmitting under British control, sending exactly what MI5 wanted Germany to receive. The intelligence deceptions this enabled shaped the course of the war at its most critical moments. The protection of Normandy alone, the disinformation that held German panzer divisions waiting at Pas de Calais while Allied forces established the foothold that would eventually end the Third Reich, may represent the single most consequential intelligence operation of the entire Second World War. And underneath all of it, like a foundation stone that the entire structure rests on without most people ever knowing it's there, is a rule articulated in a briefing room in Surrey in 1940. A struck man will lie. Therefore, do not strike. Oh, it sounds almost too simple. It sounds like something that should have been obvious, that should not have required enforcement, that any competent intelligence officer in any nation would have understood without being told. And yet, look at the record. Look at how consistently, across decades and conflicts and continents, the lesson that Stevens applied with undeviating discipline has had to be relearned. At terrible cost, again and again. The simple truth is that maintaining the standard Stevens maintained, in the middle of the Blitz, with friends dying, with the war genuinely uncertain, with trained enemy agents in cells below your feet, was not simple at all. It required something rare and genuinely valuable. The ability to separate what you feel from what you do, and to hold a professional standard against the full weight of human emotion, and not allow the emotion to win. Stevens held it. Camp 020 held it. And the double-cross system that those standards made possible helped win the war. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being difficult to understand. Robin Stevens was not a man who invited understanding. He did not cultivate warmth. He did not explain himself. He gave orders, enforced them, produced results, and moved on. The memoirs of colleagues who worked alongside him tend to circle around the edges of who he actually was, as though the man himself had declined to present an accessible interior, and kept that decision even after the war ended. What we have, instead, is the record. Every agent turned. Every false transmission sent. Every panzer division held in place on the wrong beach. The entire architecture of the double-cross system built, piece by invisible piece, in quiet rooms, by a man with a glass eye and a policy of absolute restraint. And then, the shadow. The investigation. The question that will not close. There is a reading of Stevens that wants to find, beneath the cold professionalism, something genuine. Some private belief that the men across the table from him deserved to be treated with a basic dignity that violence would have violated. Some sense that the rule was not only efficient, but right. maybe that reading is accurate. The record doesn't rule it out. There is another reading, less comfortable, and perhaps more honest. A reading in which Stevens's principle was always entirely tactical, in which the rule held at Camp 020 because Camp 020 required it. And the rule was not applied at Bad Nendorf because Bad Nendorf's requirements were perceived as different. A reading in which there was no underlying moral conviction, only a sophisticated, context-dependent calculation. That happened in one facility to produce outcomes indistinguishable from mercy. Both readings produce the same outcome at Camp 020. Both readings produce the same intelligent success. Both readings lead to the same contribution to the same victory in the same war. But they produce very different answers to the question of what Robin Stevens actually was. And that question, which is ultimately a question about whether goodness requires good intentions, or whether good outcomes can stand alone, is one that philosophy has been arguing about for centuries, and has not settled. WWII does not settle it either. He just forces you to sit with it. WWII sat in one chair, an enemy of Britain sat in the other, and in the silence between them, in the controlled, disciplined, absolutely uncompromising silence that Stevens maintained like a weapon, somewhere in that silence lay the difference between winning and losing. He did not raise his hand, and in not raising it, he may have helped save the world. Whether he deserves the title of humane man or merely effective one is a question the record refuses to answer. Perhaps that is the most honest thing about him. He was not made for easy answers. He was made for the truth, whatever the cost. Camp 020 processed over 480 German intelligence agents during World War II. Not one successful escape was recorded. The double-cross system achieved near total penetration of German intelligence networks in Britain. Operation Fortitude, supported by double-cross intelligence, successfully deceived German high command about the D-Day landings. Robin Stevens was acquitted of most charges following the Bad Nendorf investigation in 1947. He died in 1965. His full service record remains partially classified. The interrogation rooms at Latchmere House no longer exist. The building was demolished in 1990. The most powerful thing a man can do in a room with an enemy is stay completely in control of himself. The operating principle of Camp 020, 1940 to 1945. WWII never explained himself. But you can. And down in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching this from. And tell me this. Was he humane? Or was he just more intelligent than everyone else? Because that question has no clean answer. And I want to know which side of it you land on. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Not for the algorithm. For the 480 men who sat across that table. And the tens of thousands who crossed that beach. Subscribe if you want more of the stories history decided to bury. We find them. We bring them back. And next time, the story is even stranger than this one. Thanks you for watching.